much. All right. Okay. So I'm going to hit continue so that way I'm good. I can say. So if any of you just came in, I put a few poll questions into this talk because I think it's nice sometimes, especially for career-related topics, to get a sense of what other people are also thinking about when it comes to their future. So if you want to participate, you can go to polllevy.com/Propel Careers or text Propel Careers to 22333. Then you'll be a part of the poll questions, and it's kind of fun to see what people are thinking about. So I'm also going to send Gabby the slides as well, so that way she'll send them all to you as a reference. And then, of course, as she mentioned, this is being recorded. So the first thing I want to mention is that a lot of people feel nervous doing informational interviews. So if you're someone here on this webinar and you're thinking, oh, I'm so nervous at the thought of actually doing this, you're not alone. So the great thing is you're here, so we can talk about how do you maximize these experiences? How do you ask the right questions? How do you make sure that you're getting information that's useful for your future? And so I'm hoping by the end of this talk, you'll have some insights around this. As I'm talking, feel free, if you have questions, utilize, you either unmute yourself and talk, ask the question, or use the chat box if you feel more comfortable, or if you email Gabby, like a direct message her, she can then ask as well to gather feedback for all of you. The other thing I want to stress is that as a student, you should leverage your student status. So one of the nice things about being a student is at some point, it should end. Hopefully you graduate. You know, you can't be a student forever. I mean, I've seen some students that go to school for years and years and years at different programs, but technically it's meant to be a training situation such that you do something after you're done. And so none of you should feel awkward doing an informational interview because guess what? You have to do something after you're done school. And most people will appreciate the fact that you're taking time out of your day to understand what's the best fit for you. Once you're not a student, it's a little more challenging to get access to certain people, but I just want to stress, and I'll probably mention this a few more times, leverage your student status because people want to help the next generation of leaders across the life sciences, healthcare, high tech, and other areas that you may get involved in. So just keep that in mind. I try to be optimistic when I give my talks because I think it's helpful to be able to do that. And I just want to mention again, in case anyone else has come in, I put a few poll questions into the talk. And so at the top of the slide, there's a few ways to get access to the polls. So that way you can be a part of the action here. And so I want to cover a few things in the about hour and a half or so that we have together. And the first part is I want to talk a little bit about what's important to you for your career, because this I feel like helps to frame how to do informational interviewing, what questions to ask, how to engage people, because if you don't know what's important to you, it's going to be really hard to ask things to make sure you get the right information to help you make decisions for your future. I'll then dive into what is informational interviewing, how do you structure informational interviewing, what questions do you ask, how do you find people, and such. We have a few breakout rooms that we've set up for today to be able to have you guys interact, but also to be able to have you share some insights from each of the rooms, which I think will be helpful for everyone here. And again, if you have questions, comments, and such while I'm talking, feel free to let us know via chat box, via just speaking what you're thinking, because I'm sure you're not the only person thinking about whatever question that is. Okay, so the first thing, I'm just curious to get a read of the group here. I feel like from the job searching side, there's a few buckets that people will fall into. Some people at the top of this may be in the purple box where like everything looks super interesting. You look at these job postings or these organizations and you're like, oh, that sounds great. Oh, that sounds great too. That sounds even better. And it's like everything seems exciting. Or sometimes people get paralyzed by I'm not really sure what I want to do, so I'm not really sure, what's out there. So some of you maybe are in that bucket. Some of you maybe are in the second bucket, where there's certain career paths that seem like a better fit, and you're trying to figure out like what one or ones could be the right area. Some of you maybe are at the bottom, where you know what you want, you just need someone to hire you for that particular opportunity. And so I'm curious, for the first poll question, and hopefully this will work, where do you fall? And if any of you don't want to do the poll, feel free in the chat box to just mention like whatever letter corresponds to your area of interest. And we'll give it a few minutes to see. So awesome. Thank you guys so far for participating. I think it's just kind of nice. Like, I guess the one benefit of COVID right now and Zoom is that we do a lot more of these interactive things. So it's a little bit more anonymous than if you were just sitting all in a room, having to indicate, what's there. And so we seem to be, a lot of you seem to be in the B area, where it's like a lot of roles look interesting. You're kind of trying to probably figure out which ones are most relevant. Sometimes you read job descriptions, and then when you actually talk to someone in the role, you're like, wow, I did not know that job was like that as you describe it, because sometimes it's hard to tell. Awesome. But we have a mix, which is great. And that's where informational interview comes in handy, because you can really get a sense of what's out there. So thank you all for participating in this. So the other thing, which is why I think it's helpful to start reflecting on what are you looking for first, is I feel like informational interview helps you develop and or refine your job search checklist, which is a list of things that are important to you in whatever role you end up taking. From a practicality standpoint, it could be things like you want to walk to work, or you want to be on public transit, or you want to drive an hour each way. I don't know. Some people like to decompress before they get home. Some people want to have certain requirements, like they want to lead people, or they do not want to lead people. It's a lot of work and stuff, or they want to work for a big place or a small place, or have a certain culture and so forth. And so hopefully many of you have a job search checklist that you've been at least in your head creating, but hopefully you have something where you can actually write down these things that are important to you. And we'll have our first breakout session. We'll have each of you talk about this, because I feel like these, for me, become anchors in your search. If you said you wanted to work somewhere within 5 miles of where you live, well, that kind of starts to define places you might look at. Or maybe you have a certain passion to work in a certain area of disease like cancer. So then, okay, that helps define certain places. Or maybe you want to work for an organization that has, many locations because you want to work for a large global company. Well, then that could affect some of your searches. And so I'm always curious to get a sense of like what's important to each of you, because it could be different depending upon life situations, depending upon, personal passions and interests. And I feel like with this time during COVID, I feel like it's given people a lot of opportunity to really reflect on what's important to them, because life is, it can be short in many cases. And, you want to make sure that you're spending time doing something that's meaningful and, where you feel good about the work that you do. And, these anchors, to put it back into perspective for informational interviewing, these anchors can help plan questions that you might ask. And I'll mention one example, and then we'll definitely talk in much more detail about this. But I have certain friends that, for different reasons, can't travel with their job. And so you start seeing some of these roles, and they look so exciting. And then you realize that, well, in that role, you might travel half of your time, like out of the state, overnight hotels, and so forth. And so, an easy practical question that a number of people will ask now is, what's the, let's say travel percentage of this particular position? Because it's sometimes hard to tell with respect to their role. And, for each of you, you'll have different questions based upon your interests. But it's just helpful to be thinking about making these discussions useful for you. And so for the first breakout room, what I'd love to have each of you talk about in your breakout is what's important to you in terms of whatever career, whatever role, whatever you end up taking next. Because I think hopefully we'll see some themes here. We're going to spend about 5 minutes per breakout room. And then I would love if one person from each breakout room would feel comfortable just sharing, a few things that are important to the group, because I think it's helpful for others to see what others are thinking about on this context. And so I guess we'll have Gabby start the first breakout room. You guys will be randomly assigned to a room, and then report back in about 5 minutes. And I'm looking forward to hearing what your thoughts are.
Actually, Lauren, they can select their breakout room. So do you want to change it to random, or do you want me to have them select?
You can do it. You can have them select. That's great.
Okay. All right. They are now open.
Awesome.
All right, everyone, select your breakout room. You should have a message. You have 3 breakout rooms, one where you discuss what's important in your career, a second one where you discuss questions you want to ask during the informational interview, and a third one where you discuss questions you're worried to ask during the informational interview.
And actually, Gabby, I was thinking about doing 3 individual ones. So first is like the what's important, and then like next we would do the questions to ask.
Okay, I see. I thought it was 3.
But no worries, we could start with this, and then we can, for the other 2, maybe we could focus just on questions to ask and then questions you're worried about. I should have been more specific in terms of
I will go ahead and assign all of them to the.
Cool. All right. Well, welcome back. I know that time goes by so quick. So, in the group I was in, a few things came up around, thinking about long-term career. I'm going to paraphrase a bit, like long-term career growth and how, let's say, the work-life balance or how some of the responsibilities may change over time, which could help in terms of planning for different things that may happen in the future. Part of it also was around like thinking about the path of least resistance versus other types of opportunities that might be maybe a little bit more like challenging or intense right now, but perhaps could lead to some interesting opportunities that might not have been present now upon taking those, or thinking about how the organization you work with and how that aligns to your values and just the overall environment and culture of an organization. But does anyone want to share other things important to them that they're thinking about for their future?
I kind of do. There's one thing I always kind of wanted to think about is like you'll never really realize how much you fight for something until you see the end result of it. So I think one of the things is technology is very broad and it can be used in so many different ways, capitalistically and otherwise. And at first, I kind of had the standard dream. Okay, I was going to work for a giant tech company and make lots of cash. And, it's a nice idea to create innovations. And then I'm kind of seeing the adverse effects of innovations as well, because we've had, a lot of deep fakes where you have politicians saying outrageous things and they never really said it. It was just somebody being clever with some software. And I realized I want to do tech, but I want tech with ethics. And that's something that has been really big on me. I wish there was more opportunities. Like I see Tech Jobs for Good, which is a good job board, but I kind of wish there's more entry level opportunities for that.
I'll have to follow up with you, Irving, about maybe some job search opportunities and kind of where to look. And that could even be one of the informational interview questions you might ask is, where have you seen sources to look for opportunities in the space? And it's possible that people working in the fields you want to be in may have some additional insights around, what they've seen that's useful. Does anyone else want to share other things that are important to them as they think about their future? Feel free to utilize the chat box, or feel free as we're going through this to share thoughts that you're thinking about, just because I think it's helpful for others to hear what people are thinking about. So in terms of informational interviewing, let me spend a few minutes talking a little bit more about, what is this? How do we leverage this? How do we go about thinking about different questions that you could ask? And then we'll do a breakout where we'll have each of you talk about questions you may want to ask. And because I think that, again, will be helpful for people to see different things that are on your mind. So this is not an actual job interview itself, although it sometimes can lead to job interviews. So you definitely want to take the interaction seriously. And as an aside, actually, as an example of how this can be helpful, this is a discussion that you do to gain information about a certain area, a certain organization, a certain career field, a certain programs. It's not just for job searching itself. There's a number of things that are helpful. The second question I wanted to ask is, what concerns you most about informational interviewing? And we're going to touch on a number of these topics to help you navigate what's there. But not surprisingly, those of you that are doing the poll feature, not knowing what to ask, nervous reaching out to people, how do you find people, how do you follow up? I'll give some tips for each of these. And then if any of you have other suggestions or thoughts, feel free to utilize the chat box. And that can be one nice way of having a follow-up that we can share with people afterwards. And if any of you mention E in terms of other things that concern you, if you're comfortable sharing, feel free to put in the chat box what that might be, or ask a question perhaps around that, and we can try to address it to provide some insights on that. So informational interviews aren't just for jobs, for graduate school, for medical school, for other academic programs you may want to do in the future. It can really be helpful to understand, is this place going to be the right fit? The right environment? Is it going to allow you to build the right skills for what you're looking for? But certainly it can help a lot with understanding the organization, the career path. So even for myself, when I started my company, Propel Careers, in 2009, which feels like ages ago, I started doing informational interviews because I knew I wanted to work in an entrepreneurial setting. I knew I wanted to help people. I knew I wanted to be involved in life sciences. And I wasn't exactly sure what that title or area might look like. So I started talking to people, and it turns out that I ended up starting my own company as opposed to working for someone else. But it was completely eye-opening for me in terms of understanding about what's out there. And so for me, I tried to make a list of questions that were important to me to be able to understand more about organizational culture, more about career paths, more about different ways that I could use my skills to help people, and then also kind of build a meaningful, career for myself. And so I'm hoping for all of you, as you reflect on what's important to you, and as you reflect on your future career goals and family goals and such, you can then think about questions that are important, for you. And so if we think about it from a, organizational perspective, there's a few buckets that I feel are important to highlight when thinking about questions you could ask to gain insights about certain areas. And so you could focus on, certain jobs or certain programs if you're thinking about additional schooling down the road. You could think also about, the organization, because I talk to a lot of people and they say, Lauren, I'm applying to a certain place like the Gates Foundation, and it's great. It's a great place. They do great work. They make a difference in the lives of people. But I'll ask, the person that said that, I said, well, have you ever talked to someone at the Gates Foundation? Do you know it's a good fit for you? And oh no, but it looks amazing. They do great work, and they do great work. But I would just urge everyone, if you have ideas of places you might want to be, it never is a bad idea to talk to people in the organization just to confirm, hopefully, what you think about the organization to make sure it will be a fit, especially if you're going to narrow your search down to just a few places that you're looking at. For many of you, and this was brought up in one of the breakout rooms around thinking about your career progression, thinking about, it was mentioned now, many people are not afraid to work long hours, not, concerned too much about that per se relative to, things. But as you start having, let's say, a family and have other obligations outside of work and things like that, you might want to think about a career that allows you to have opportunities to engage and not just spend, 90 hours a week working and things. And then, of course, from a practical side, how do you get into some of these career areas and so forth? And so when I think about this, there could be a few types of, focus areas for questions, depending upon, what you're thinking about. And if you're thinking about a certain job, forensic scientists versus, let's say, research scientists within a biotech company, and the skill sets could be applicable to both areas because of the transferability of some of the techniques and things that you might use. You could find people in both settings and ask, well, what do you do day to day? What are some of the techniques? How do you build your skills? What are skills you actually need right now for the role versus what organizations might train on? I know it's hard because you see sometimes these job descriptions that have, 10, 15, 20 bullet points of all the things they want. And it turns out that maybe only 10 of those things are must-haves. The rest are nice to have, but unless you talk to someone, you might assume all 20 are the, definitively need to have to be competitive, for that role. I like asking people also things like, what do they like about their organization or role? And let's say, what might they change, i.e. what might they dislike? It's sometimes helpful to know, because maybe what they dislike is no big deal to you. And it's like, okay, cool. If that's the biggest issue, it's fine. I can deal with that. Or maybe it is kind of a game changer. For the organization, culture was brought up a few times. What's the culture of the group? How do they value diversity? How do they enable everyone's heard? How do they help develop people in the organization? What's the management style? What kind of people seem to fit best? And again, practical things like what skills are needed, what skills are valued, how does the organization train people, and so forth. On the career progression side, asking questions more around like some of the, how would you get from this role into, let's say, the head of a department, or, some other function that you want to get involved in, just to be able to help kind of plan. Sometimes it can take years to develop the skills needed to be a director of a group. In other cases, it's more about, other exposure you might get throughout the organization, but it's always helpful, I think, to identify people that can be mentors that can help you. And we'll talk a little more about how do you find people for these. And then in many cases, many of you are probably thinking, how do I get in? How do I get hired? How does your organization hire? Because sometimes they hire through referrals, or they hire through certain career fairs, or they hire through certain, recruiters, or through other avenues. And it's just helpful to know, just so you can kind of maximize the connection ability in terms of, fits for you. There's also a few other questions that I like to suggest that people also, think about. You don't have to ask all of these questions, because some of you might be thinking, oh my gosh, Lauren, like there's so much. I only have maybe a half hour with someone, or 45 minutes. So you had kind of pick and choose what's important to you. But, how's your organization different from others? Is there anyone else that I could speak with that you know of? Are there certain reports I can read to learn more about this area of work? Have you seen other people move into other roles with a similar background? Because it's one of those things where sometimes you only know of roles once you're aware that that role exists. And so I love leveraging people's expertise, because they may have seen others similar to you. Other advice to think about: are there relevant networking groups or blogs or conferences or professional associations for your area of interest? Sometimes it's just getting a few more of those keywords, or having opportunities now virtually to meet with a few more people can open up a whole realm of opportunities, for you. You can also ask, what's an average salary for X role? I mean, you can't ask someone what is their salary or what was their starting salary, but certainly, utilize your student status. I'm, finishing up soon. I'm trying to get a lay of the land. I'm just curious, like, do you have an idea just for budgetary purposes so you can plan? And again, how do people get into this role? What's the growth trajectory, so on, and so forth. There's a lot. The important thing is there's a lot. So I'll talk to some friends of mine and they'll say, Lauren, the informational interview wasn't useful. And I'll say, well, what did you ask them? And they'll say, well, I just let them talk. I figured that would be useful, and I'd gain insights from what they say. And don't ever do that. You want to be targeted in your questions, so that way you get information out that could be helpful, for you. And so for the second breakout room, it'd be great if we were to break out into like a few groups where you guys can talk a little bit about, questions that are important to you to be able to think about your informational interview approaches. And so I guess we can start the second breakout room. We'll have 5 minutes, similar to last time, and then we can try to report back with like questions you guys are thinking, just because that might help everyone, think about different ways to ask certain questions. So a few questions came up that I just want to mention for the broader audience in case it's helpful. And so one of the questions was around, like, how do you know if someone actually wants to do the informational interview? And, you know, I would just say if someone says that they're open to talking with you, then I think by default, they're open to talking with you and they've agreed to share details. In my experience, most people won't commit to doing an informational interview if they're not interested in actually like talking with you or engaging with you. They might, you know, if you were to write to them and say, I'm interested in talking with you, they might write back and say, I'm really sorry, it's really busy right now, I don't have time, or you know what, I'm not the right person, my colleague Tom is a better fit for you to speak with, or they may find some way to maybe not respond inadvertently and so on and so forth. So I think if people got back to you, they probably want to help. The key is to make sure that you can ask the right questions so that way you get the information out of it that's helpful to you. Are there other questions or other things that are important to you that you want to ask that can be helpful in terms of you making career decisions? I'm just curious in case it helps everyone else think about these.
Remember, you can put the question in the chat. You don't have to unmute yourself. So if you have any questions, now's the time to ask.
Mm-hmm. And I guess while you guys are thinking, Irving mentioned something about like, how do you read the interviewer's body language? So this is really hard actually, because now, okay, in most cases, any informational interview is going to be via a thing like Zoom or via phone, because it's still not technically safe to meet people in person that you haven't been spending time with. And so it's hard, you only see their shoulders up, right? It's really hard to read body language unless you can see someone, their eyes, I guess you can see, but oftentimes it's a little bit challenging. Because I don't think during an informational interview, someone's going to be like acting annoyed or rolling their eyes or things you might get if you were having other discussions about stuff that's not informational interview oriented. But if you are in person, then it's a little bit more important to probably like look out for signs of just how people might be interacting, if they seem to be nervous, because sometimes the people you speak with are also nervous about informational interviews, especially if any of you reach out to people that are more junior in terms of their career. Like you literally might be the first person they've informational interviewed with. So just keep that in mind also. And so they might be nervous about trying to make a good impression, trying to share information that's useful. So it's, it's interesting to think about it from the other person's perspective. If you think of other questions or thoughts, I have a few more slides that I wanted to share. And so, but feel free to use the chat box or again. I have a
question potentially for, not for you, but on your, just your thoughts on when going to an informational interview, keeping your camera on or off, what do you suggest?
Oh, thank you, Gabby, for asking. I definitely would suggest camera on, just because it's a lot easier to help build personal relationships, even though I know it's not the same as in person. At least then you can see the person, you can see them smile and try to get a sense of engagement and that sort of thing. With that said too, I would also suggest like trying to, let's say from the waist up, look business casual in a sense, i.e. probably not have like a hoodie on, maybe you just woke up kind of look, try to, I don't mean to joke about that, but sometimes like even for interviews, a few friends of mine have been super informal and, you want to try to make an impression that shows that you care about your future and that you're like professional in that type of context, right? You don't have to have a suit on per se, but just, maybe a button down shirt or a sweater or something. So that way it looks like you're excited about the discussions and that sort of thing. And to talk a little bit more about like some of these logistics, I know a number of you had questions around this. Usually these are 15 to 30 minutes in length, sometimes longer. So one thing I suggest to people is don't back up, like don't pick, okay, next Tuesday, I'm going to have 8 informational interviews just so I can get used to them. And because inevitably 1 or 2 is going to run over. If you start asking people, so tell me about your career, what do you like most? Some people love talking about these things, and they get excited that someone else might be excited about their career path. And so the time may run over. So keep that in mind too. Just make sure you don't have like necessarily a hard stop at the end of that half-hour discussion in case it goes over by a few minutes. I mentioned typically, again, phone, Skype, Zoom type of things. Let the person decide what works best for them. Also, when it comes to things like let them potentially pick the time. Some people like to do it early morning or late evening or over lunch because maybe they have some free time in their schedule. So you could be a little bit flexible with respect to that. I'm not going to dive in deep in terms of like resume format. I'll talk a little bit about LinkedIn in the context of informational interviewing, but it could be helpful for you to either send them a copy of your resume and or LinkedIn profile beforehand, just so they have some sense of your background, so they can have some sense of, what you might be asking. Certainly you could send a few questions that you may have so they can prepare. And that way you get to maximize the time that you spend. And we'll talk in a few minutes about referrals and how do you find people that could be helpful, because that way that can help you a lot in terms of connecting with people that could be relevant. I love it. And I'll in a minute, I'll show a sample email template that you could use. I mean, feel free to modify it for your own purposes. But, for me, when people reach out to me to do informational interviews, I love it when they give me a few questions they want me to talk about, because then I can think about, okay, how would I address this question about work-life balance? Or how would I address this question about skills that are needed? Or how would I address this question about, career path and what could that look like in the future, or whatever it might be? Because then, again, I can try to maximize the time. People that agree to do informational interviews want to be helpful, right? And they appreciate the fact that you're being really thoughtful and really serious about your career planning. And so it's useful to make sure that it's actually worthwhile, for you. So here's a sample, email. I'll just walk through a few quick points just to put a few things in context. So the first thing is I would suggest in the subject line, make it specific, like referral from X person, because if they know that person, they're more open to reading the email that you send. Or you could say, John J, like fellow John J student, or if they were an alumni, for example. Or if you met someone through a women's group, like Association for Women in Science, fellow AWIS member, whatever. It could be a minor thing to mention, but some people that all of you may reach out to maybe get a couple hundred or more emails a day. I talked to a friend of mine at a biotech in Cambridge, and he had something like 68,000 unread messages. That's just absurd. But if you were emailing someone like him, and if your subject line wasn't specific, he might just kind of ignore it, not because he doesn't want to answer it, but because he's got a bunch of other emails that he hasn't gotten to either. So specific subject line, and then, kind of short and sweet email, like John suggested I reach out to you. I'm writing to see if you have, let's say, 15 to 30 minutes for an informational interview. You could give them a brief description of your background. You're currently a student, you're finishing up in some sort of time frame perhaps. You're looking for a certain type of role. Through the discussion, I'm looking to learn more about whatever's important to you. This information will help me decide which path is best. I've attached my resume, look forward to your time. And then always include your phone number and email address in this email, just because sometimes, not right now with COVID, but before COVID, you might have reached out to someone, maybe they're waiting for the train or a plane or whatever, and they have a few minutes in the airport and they just call you because it's just easier for them to just call you quickly and answer the questions. And so anyway, or maybe they forward your email on to someone else because they're not the right person, but their colleague actually has a similar background to you. So they'll forward your email. Sometimes when you forward emails, your actual email address doesn't always forward. I don't know why. If anyone knows IT, maybe you know why. But anyway, if you include your email address in every email, it's easy for them to follow up and be able to get back to you. That's a little nitpicky, but it could be helpful. Sometimes I get informational interview requests and I get the whole life story of the person, which can be overwhelming. If you read emails on your phone, sometimes it's like, anything more than 10 lines looks like massively long, even though it's not that long. So short, sweet. Again, you could send a few questions if you want to that you want to get asked or get answered, and that can help you in terms of that discussion. If you do have the discussion with someone, and if it starts to be approaching 30 minutes, you could interrupt real quick and say, Lisa, I know I asked for 30 minutes. Do you have a few more minutes to go over, or I just want to be respectful of your time. So, you can make sure that you're not suddenly just going to like 3 hours, unless for some reason Lisa's having such a fun time talking to you that she'll happily, do that. And then the last thing I want to mention right now is that because many people are virtual, more so than before COVID, more people are actually reachable for informational interviews, because it used to be that a lot of people worked in co-working spaces or open office seating. So it was really hard for them to reserve a conference room during the day when a bunch of other people maybe they were working with, needed to also have the conference room. So it was like, why is John going into the conference room? And whatever, they might think he's job searching, but he's just doing an informational interview. Now people are home more. So they might be more open actually, and they might actually like a break in their day to actually talk to someone who's super enthusiastic about their role, as opposed to just another work call or email call. So just keep in mind, you might be doing the person a favor by engaging with you. And so I guess for the third breakout room, I was curious, what are some questions that you're afraid to ask? Or we could just stay in this room and maybe have you guys, if anyone wants to share, are there certain questions that people are afraid to ask or aren't sure how to ask? Because I'm always curious to see what people are thinking about.
How about asking how somebody with their background can get into a position like that? Maybe that's something that could potentially be difficult to ask. Because as a student, right, you don't have a lot of background. So.
Totally. Sometimes I like to ask that more broadly, what kind of backgrounds have you seen in this role, or if you share the resume with the person beforehand, theoretically they should have looked at it. So you could even ask them something like, based upon my background, are there any additional courses or experiences that would make me more competitive for this role? Because they might be able to give you concrete examples of maybe people they've hired, people they've seen move in, which could be helpful for you as you're planning your future. What are other things that you're thinking about or that might stress you out when you think about question asking?
Maybe something around finding a job in their company, or there's a question in the chat. Yeah. So finding it, what can they do to find a job in their company, or can they help them get a job?
Yep. Well, so thank you, Gabby, for asking. So in a perfect world, Gabby, if I was doing an informational interview with you and I wanted to learn more about, how could I have your type of role? I would assume if your if John Jay was hiring, I assume you might say, Lauren, we're actually going to be hiring. Here's a role that might interest you. You assume that just by saying I'm interested in your type of role, people should understand that they should let you know if things come up in their organization. So I don't think you always have to be so blunt of like being so explicit as saying, I want to work in your company. One thing I would suggest though, because this has happened to a few friends of mine where they see a certain company and they're like, oh, that company looks great. And I always suggest to them, if they're going to reach out to, so let's say they don't know anyone in a certain company, but they see there's an alumni that works at the company. I always suggest to them, instead of writing to them and saying, dear John, I see you work at X company. I'd love to work there. I would suggest writing, dear John, I'd love to learn more about your organization. I'm exploring career options, and I would just love insights that you might have to provide. Because the thing is, sometimes you end up talking to John and you realize, wow, that company seems so stressful. I don't think I want to work there. And so then it's great that you didn't email him directly and say, I want to work at your company. Can you have an informational interview with me so I can learn more? You keep it more open, because there's, another comment in the chat box about like avoiding companies with scandals or issues like that. And sometimes you might not always know about these things until you start doing more research and you're like, oh my gosh. So I would always err on the side of, when you reach out to people, it's more about like learning about their career path, learning about things to help you as you think about your career. And if it seems like a match between you and the person you're talking with, then you could perhaps approach hey, I'm looking for a job actually in your space. Or again, they might bring it up so you can be aware. A few of my friends, you read on Glassdoor and sites like that, like this company's always has a bunch of, it's like putting out fires every day. It's so stressful. You never know what you're going to get. But some of my friends love stressful and I don't know. So it's like, pay attention to some of these other sources. And then if you end up talking to someone, maybe you can ask, like, it looks like it's a little bit hectic here. Can you tell me a little more about how you deal with that, or how the work-life balance might be? Because it just can help you a little bit in how you engage with people, on this. Other questions or comments that you guys are thinking about?
So that's something that I think about, but not as a way to inform your informational interviews, is using Glassdoor to see what their employees, current and former, think about the company and the benefits and the pay and all that.
Yeah, it can be helpful to do some of your background research. So that way, for example, if the company's well known for like lots of vacation time and lots of, employee benefits, then it's like, okay, that information from the Glassdoor site, for example, then you can talk in more specifics about, which of the benefits do you like best? Or, it allows you to have a little bit deeper of a conversation, and hopefully, again, allows you to have a bit more like insights for yourself on this. Let me spend a few minutes talking about, like, how do you find people to be able to interact with, to have some of these discussions, with. And so, all of you may have a number of people that you have interacted with through various organizations or educational experiences or family connections or, mentors, and things. And so as you think about your larger network, hopefully you think more broadly than just maybe the people that you directly interact with on a day-to-day, basis. Lab mates, former colleagues, if you've had internships and jobs and other experiences before, during, school, friends of yours, of course. So, and when I think about friends, so for example, I have a lot of friends that are architects, and some people would say, well, Lauren, like, you work in biotech. Why are your architecture friends useful to biotech? And I say, well, some of them build biotech buildings. Like, you don't have to always find that friend who just works in your area of interest. You might have people that know people you know, I make a joke with friends of mine that are accountants, right? Like accountants can be useful because they do the books for tons of different companies, especially if they work at an accounting firm that works with a bunch of, you know, hospital and health tech and biotech and IT and other places. So I guess think broadly about that. You know, mentors, of course, alumni organizations. Maybe you're a member of a certain organization like Women in Bio, LinkedIn. I'll talk about that in a second. And then even, you know, people that write blogs or speak about your area of interest. It could be a cold email, but if you read someone's information that seems relevant to what you want to do, again, utilize your student status. People are much more open to helping the future leaders of our industries. So you can take advantage of that when you're engaging with people, because it shows, again, you're really thoughtful in terms of your future. And so when I think about things like, for example, if, you know, certain nationality focus groups. So I've had that, so it's fun. I've had the opportunity in the last couple of years to speak at like the Taiwanese Biotech Association, ACUSA, which is the Association of Spanish people in biotech mostly, but it covers other areas too, UK and French and Chinese and, you know, other places. It's just fascinating. And so there might be a nationality focus group that you can be a part of, and that might help in terms of connecting. I know in Boston, there's a young professional healthcare network. So if you're a young professional, which many of you fall into that category, you can connect with them and learn more about different opportunities within the healthcare setting. And I'm sure in the New York City area, there's groups like that exist. There's minority focus groups like SACNIS, which is great. I know New York Academy of Sciences does some things. Also, there's some functional areas of expertise. So I list a few here just to kind of mention some specifics, but there's many, many more. And I'm happy if any of you want to reach out to me. I'm happy to see if I know of groups that are relevant to your interests that can be useful. But one example, if you wanted to be a medical writer, there's the Medical Writer Association. They have chapters in different cities like New York and Boston and Chicago and Philadelphia. And so by now, even just joining virtual events they might have planned, you get to meet other people that are in that space. Or, you know, if you had a passion for diabetes research, you could get involved in the local chapter of the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. And, you know, it may sound silly to say this, but if you were to, let's say in non-COVID times, help plan walkathons and the big gala dinner they have to raise money and such, other people that are a part of that organization also work at some of the hospitals and healthcare settings and other groups that are focused in that space. And so I'm not saying volunteer just to get a job, but you could volunteer and you might interact with people that are relevant to what you want to do in the future. And that can be amazing in terms of just connections, to put yourself in the place to meet people that are relevant. So these are all in addition to the alumni networks and your, you know, personal networks that can help you identify people that could be a fit. It's been amazing for the last 10 years. I've been amazed by how many different groups are there. I'm hoping that as you're doing your job search, or, you know, again, like for additional academic opportunities search, you can make a list of places of interest, and then you can share that with friends of yours. Hey, do you know anyone at, you know, X place? Because who knows? Maybe they play soccer with someone that works there, or their neighbor's daughter works there, or their, you know, dentist office person knows. And you never know. It's a really, really small world, surprisingly, as you get down to that. And most people, when they're looking for jobs, don't always keep an actual list of places. I can know from experience, it's in their head, or they have different folders on their computer. But make your life easier, and then you can share these things with people you know to help you in that endeavor. In the chat box, I'm curious if any of you want to share, or feel free to unmute yourself and mention it. Are there certain people that you want to connect with, a certain title of person? Because it's also interesting by seeing what people are thinking about. Maybe people on this webinar know people with that title or in that, area and that sort of thing. So I'll give you guys a minute or so to be able to, if any of you want to type in, what type of person you'd love to connect with. And if any of you have questions, feel free to ask.
So I have a comment and a question. A comment is for the students, along the lines of alumni. We have a list of alumni that goes back to like 2006 that are employed in many different industries. So please ask me or Dr. Ed if we know anyone working where in a field that you want to work in, because chances are that we do. Second, it's a question. It's for you, Lauren. What, if you can say anything about how we can use these informational interviews to cultivate our mentoring network?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. Well, okay. So I think that all of us should have around us like a board of advisors, like a personal board of advisors, where it's people that you can tap into for different things, right? It could be things like you want to learn about how to get to be a certain job area, right? So you find people in that job similar to the informational interview, but maybe there's someone you really click with, right? You're having a discussion, the half hour flies by so quick, you like so want to have another half hour with them. So maybe you kind of check in with them like every quarter, every 6 months and so forth. And so when you build this like relationship, so it's someone that you can tap into for advice about your space. Maybe you also have people you can tap into for other things like, you want to get better at public speaking, or you want to get better about, giving presentations, or you want to get better, like maybe you want to start a company, so you need someone to help with accounting work, whatever it might be. But as you're meeting people, think about like, what are those experiences or what are those things you'd love to be able to gain more insight in or on? Because then as you meet with people, you can then start to build your like personal board of mentors, board of advisors. And it's kind of fun to think about it. The only caveat I'll say is most people get nervous if you ask them, Lauren, I want you to be my mentor. I love helping people. But sometimes people get nervous. So, oh my God, that's so much responsibility. So maybe you just approach it as, hey, would you mind if I check in like every 6 months if I have questions about the space? And they'll usually say, sure, that'd be great. And then they're being a mentor, but without the title. So they feel less stressed about it.
And I want to add for the students, you should almost never ask somebody to be your mentor straight up. It's sort of a relationship that happens organically. And I think Lauren's advice of checking in with them regularly will help you build that relationship with them without you outright asking them to be your mentor. So think about.
Cool. Anything else you guys are thinking about right now on this?
I just wanted to kind of clarify what Dr. Gabby said. So you're saying that just by following up and stuff like that, that eventually it's kind of like goes without saying that that person will be my mentor or whatever. But it's not like you have to ask, or it's like how if you put like a girlfriend and boyfriend or whatever, like sometimes it just happens. Say how it's like, oh, so now we're boyfriend and girlfriend. So it's like something like that just by spending time and taking the time to follow up, and it'll lead up to that without saying. Is that what it is?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the thing is, sometimes it's good to be a little more open with respect to like the relationship with the mentor, because sometimes it could be you interact with someone for like the next 2 years because their knowledge is super critical to your decisions, and then maybe for whatever reason, like 5 years goes by and you haven't talked to them, but then something comes up and you reach back out again, and so it's kind of one of these like fluid relationships where it isn't always like every 6 months you're interacting, but people often enjoy like being helpful. And so it's kind of nice to be able to keep these relationships going. And it's kind of nice when like you guys can update people on how you're doing, because it's nice to follow people's careers and to see where they progress.
I have another question. And perhaps you're going to get to this at some point, but what do you do after you've had the informational interview?
Yeah, good question, Gabby. I'll talk a little bit about it, but I can talk about it now too. So, well, first off, definitely send a thank you note, right? Like, dear John, it was so nice talking to you. I look forward to keeping in touch, blah, blah, blah. Just because it's just a nice formal thing to do. And people oftentimes don't do it. So you'll stand out in a good way when that's the case. But you could also do a few things, like maybe you were talking about some like news article or something. And maybe if you see something come across, you're like, hey, John, I just saw this from the Wall Street Journal. I don't know if you saw it, but just wanted to make sure you had it. And it's like, oh, that's so nice. Thank you so much, because you're helping them stay on top of things. Or maybe you're both a member of, like, maybe you met through a women's group and you're both a member of that women's group. So next time they have a virtual networking event, you're like, hey, Gabby, it was so great to see you, or so great to talk with you a few weeks ago. If you happen to be at this virtual thing, maybe we'll end up in a chat room together or something. I don't know. Like, there could be ways to, like, stay connected. It isn't always about asking for something, but it still lets that relationship flourish and such. And then if any of you in the chat box, if there's a certain organization you want to find someone at, feel free to write it in. And the other reason to write it in is because maybe Gabby knows an alumni person, or maybe I know someone there. Like, empower us to help you. That's half the battle with informational interviewing, is empower your network to help you connect with the people you want, because it's amazing how, again, small of a world. I know I've said that like a few times and such. So then I guess to build upon that, and feel free and continue to write in the chat box if you want to about people you know or want to know or whatever. Using LinkedIn, right, is so helpful to be able to find people, to be able to connect with people, to be able to look at backgrounds, to be able to give you a sense of who you could speak with for informational interviews. I just wanted to mention one feature on LinkedIn, just in case you for some reason you're not leveraging this. In the top search box, you can search by like title, medical writing, for example, but whatever title you are interested in, you could search by. Then you can filter. If you hit the filter button, and then all these filters come up, like connections of people you know, locations, current places of employment, previous places, certain industries, alumni, associations, et cetera, et cetera. It's really cool. So you can filter by a whole bunch, because sometimes you'll do an informational interview and they'll be like, yeah, Lauren, if I know anyone, feel free to reach out. And you're like, how do I know if you know anyone? Well, guess what? You could search by medical writing, connections of Gabby in New York City. And then I could be like, hey, Gabby, guess what? It looks like you know this person. Could you make an intro? And Gabby's like, sure. So it's just like, try to use your network in a way that helps you. But anyway, if you do all the filtering, you can then find, again, you can filter by school, you can filter by a whole range of stuff. People pop up, and then you can look to see, who these people are. One thing I want to let you know, because not everyone's aware of this, if I were to click on Daphne's profile, and in the LinkedIn profile, you have this contact info tab. If I click on that, and if you're a first degree connection with her, which means that you're connected directly, then her email address pops up. So then you can email, hey, Daphne, I see that you also know Lisa, who works at Novartis. Could you make an intro? It's easier for people to respond via email sometimes than in mail. So that might just help a little bit in terms of getting responses from people that you're reaching out to. As a last resort, if you can't find any connection or any email for someone, then sure, use the InMail on LinkedIn. But a lot of people that are working don't always check their LinkedIn InMails. And so inadvertently, you might not hear back for that reason. It's like a nuance that, so when it comes to LinkedIn, similar to a resume, you want to make sure you have it together, because people might look you up before they talk with you. And if you don't have one, it's okay too. But the key is, if you do have one, I love it when I see students actually have details about who they are, what they're thinking about, what they're passionate about. It's just nice to be able to see. And so, the important thing is have information in your about section, have details about, as a student, again, there's things that you're excited by, I hope, and there's things you want to do in your future. And so it's just nice to be able to see that. Have a picture. It helps make you more approachable for folks. Also, so similar to Gabby's point, like, what can you do in terms of things? So at the end of the discussion, you can also ask the person, is there anything I can help you with? Because maybe the person you're speaking with just moved to the New York City area, and they might say, listen, I just moved here. Do you have advice about restaurants or advice about whatever? Like, you never know. You might actually have insights for them. So it never hurts to ask. I've seen a whole bunch of different things that people will mention, so it's just kind of cool to see. And then just a few other quick things, like, maybe you're going to be organizing events for Women in Bio or other things. Maybe you let them know, just so that way you can keep people posted. And they might not respond to every email you send them, but it's just nice to hear from people about things. One thing, so if Gabby and Ed are organizing, let's say, career events, panel events, things like that for the university, well then, if you had a great discussion with someone, maybe you invite them to speak. I mean, people are thrilled. They're like, oh my God, really? You enjoyed talking to me so much. You asked me to speak at your school. Like, that's really nice. And so just keep that in mind too. It's always helpful to feel like you're being useful, especially now with everything going on. And hopefully if any of you aren't doing this, then it's like, it helps Gabby too, organizing things and getting things set up. So how, in the chat box, if any of you want to share, like, how have you followed up with people? Or again, if you have questions about this, let me know, because I can definitely try to talk about a few other suggestions that could be useful.
Yeah, so I saw one of your points, and maybe like 2 slides ago, about if you see an opening in their company, you see a role in the organization that's relevant to your interests. So you let them know. What do you do in that case? Like, do you tell them, hey, I saw this position. I was wondering if I can mention you in my cover letter or my interview. Or what do you do? What can you do?
Yeah, totally. So you could certainly, so okay, sometimes, yes, okay, so in the first informational interview, if like the discussion's going well, if there seems to be chemistry, if as the person describes the company, it sounds like a good place for you, then one of the questions you might ask them is, hey, would it be okay if I see any roles in your company, if I could let you know, or maybe you could help? And they might say, sure. So then for sure, if you see a role, you could reach out and say, sometimes I'll err on the side of, hey, John, I just want to let you know, I applied to this job and I let them know that we talked 2 weeks ago. So that way you don't wait for them to say, yes, you can use my name, because maybe they just missed that email and then you're like waiting to apply until they get back to you. So I kind of err on the side of be a little more forward, but give them a heads up in case HR calls them. Hey, you talked to Gabby yesterday? I did, so that way they can mention that. Yep. But I think if you've made a connection with someone in an organization, I think after the informational interview, it's certainly appropriate to like go back to them and see if they have things they can maybe do to help with that role.
And what are some things that you, like, say if they ask you, you say, oh, if there's anything you can do for me to land this position, and they ask you for something specific, what can you suggest?
Yeah, well, so I mean, so if you ended up then doing that thing, maybe you need to learn like a programming language or something like that. And if you did, hey, I just enrolled in this course, I'm now learning how to do R, you could follow up and let them know, because then they'll be like, wow, this person's really serious about this thing. So that may help also. So that's actually a great point. That could be another way for you to follow up, just to kind of keep them posted in terms of how things are going. So one quick thing I'll mention, because sometimes like let's say I talk to Gabby and Gabby suggests I talk to Lisa. If you don't follow up with Lisa and like Gabby introduces me and Lisa together, that looks bad. So like make sure you follow up with if these people go out of their way to help you make connections or to help give you feedback, make sure you take it. Sometimes in an informational interview, I'll be like, listen, you should do X, Y, Z, you should do a little more of this. And then someone starts to get really like aggressive and I don't know why I should do that. Like we're trying to be constructive. People, it's hard to have discussions sometimes that are constructive. So just to be like, thank you so much for the feedback. I appreciate it. They wouldn't go the extra mile unless they really cared about trying to help you. You should keep track of people that you've spoken with, for the simple fact that when you get hired, or when you get into additional schooling or whatever, you could let them know, hey, you know, Dr. Smith, it was so great talking to you. Gabby made the introduction 2 years ago. Guess what? I'm now hired. Great. It's a nice way to follow up. So most people aren't this organized, but you'll do yourself a favor. And then you'll be able to help build that network, keep a track of people for like future mentors and that sort of thing. I know we're just about time, but I'm hoping you found this helpful. I know we covered a lot of different pieces around informational interviewing, but, you know, thanks for the opportunity, Gabby, to come in and talk.
Thank you for coming.